The wind woke us before the sun did. It moved across the hills in long, steady currents during the night, pressing gently against the walls of the small stone shelter where we had slept. When I stepped outside that morning, the sky was still pale gray, and the land stretched out in quiet waves of grass and rock as far as I could see. The air was cooler than the day before. I wrapped my shawl a little tighter around my shoulders and walked toward the small fire pit where David was already crouched, coaxing a flame to life with a handful of dry twigs. Pearl lay nearby, watching him with the solemn attention dogs give to ordinary tasks. Agnes, on the other hand, was halfway up a small bush investigating something that apparently required climbing. David glanced up when he heard me. Morning, morning. He nodded toward the eastern horizon. We've got a clear day. The sky was beginning to turn faintly gold. Behind us, the others were starting to stir. Mom stepped out a few minutes later, rubbing her hands together against the cool air. Dad followed close behind, carrying two small tin cups. He handed one to her. Tea. She took it gratefully. You're a good man, Harriman. I try. They stood together near the fire for a moment, watching the sunrise. Sean emerged next, stretching his shoulders dramatically as though preparing for a battle. Whose idea was it to walk across half the Middle East? He muttered. Yours, Liam said from behind him. Sean frowned. That sounds suspiciously accurate. Lucia appeared with her notebook already opened, sketching the faint outlines of the hills while the light slowly grew stronger. Claire stood quietly beside her. Francis and Father Maximilian Colby were already walking slowly along the edge of the ridge, their conversation carried away by the wind before we could hear it. The Desert Father sat on a low rock not far from the fire, wrapped in his worn cloak, eyes half closed as though listening to something deeper than the morning breeze. For a while, the camp woke gradually around the fire. Boots were pulled on. Bread was passed around. Someone tightened the straps on a pack. And then Francis returned, his expression thoughtful. We should walk soon, he said gently. The road ahead grows steeper today. Sean groaned. That seems unfair. Colby smiled. Some lessons require hills. Sean sighed. That sounds like something a saint would say. Mom laughed softly. Within a few minutes, we were moving again. The path climbed almost immediately, winding between low rock outcroppings and patches of thin grass. The land here felt older somehow, rougher, as though the hills had been carved slowly by wind and time. The breeze strengthened as we gained height. Lucia walked beside Colby for a while, her notebook tucked under her arm. Yesterday, you said courage comes from love, she said. Yes. I've been thinking about that. Colby glanced at her kindly. And? I think sometimes people confuse courage with being loud. Several people chuckled. Colby nodded. That happens often. She kicked a small stone down the slope. But love isn't loud most of the time. No. Colby's voice remained calm. Most of the strongest love in the world is very quiet. Francis slowed slightly so the group gathered around them again. The world often admires dramatic courage, he said, but heaven notices something else. Sean raised an eyebrow. What's that? Francis gestured toward the path beneath our feet. Faithfulness. The words settled into the wind like a small stone. We continued climbing. Pearl trotted ahead confidently until Agnes suddenly burst out of the grass beside the path, sending the dog into an indignant leap sideways. Sean pointed accusingly at the polecat. You are going to cause an international incident someday. Agnes looked entirely pleased with herself. Claire scooped her up before she could attempt another ambush. She's practicing courage, Claire said calmly. That's not courage, Sean replied. That's chaos. Lucia laughed. The path leveled slightly near the top of the ridge. From there, we could see the land stretching south in long, dry valleys, the grass thinning gradually as the earth grew more pale. The wind was stronger here. Dad stood beside Mom, looking out over the hills. You know, he said thoughtfully, one thing that struck me about Chet's story is how many people stepped forward after his death. Mom nodded, thinking back to the previous week. That happens often with martyrs. Colby listened quietly. Dad continued. It reminds me that courage spreads. Lucia looked at him. How? Dad shrugged. When people see someone remain faithful under pressure, it gives them strength to do the same. Colby smiled slightly. That is very true. Sean looked thoughtful. So courage isn't just about the moment. No, Colby said. It becomes a witness. The Desert Father's voice drifted toward us again. Endurance teaches more than heroism. Everyone turned slightly toward him. He stood slowly from the rock where he had been resting. A single moment of bravery may inspire admiration, he said, but a life of faithfulness shapes souls. We began descending the ridge slowly. The path here was steeper and scattered with loose stones. Dad moved slightly ahead, helping Lucia navigate the narrowest section. Pearl followed carefully behind him. Agnes rode on Claire's shoulder for once, apparently deciding that bravery had limits when cliffs were involved. After we reached the valley floor, the wind softened again. The land opened into a long stretch of low grass and scattered trees. We walked quietly for a while. Finally, Liam spoke. I've been thinking about something. What? Sean asked. The passage Alice Kay taught, Hebrews 10, about not throwing away your confidence. Maria smiled. That was a good one. Liam nodded. I realized something. What? He looked down at the path. Endurance means remembering. The Desert Father nodded slightly. Yes. If you forget what God has already done, Liam continued, it becomes much harder to keep going. Francis looked pleased. That is very wise. Lucia spoke softly. Maybe that's why Scripture tells us the same things over and over. Dad laughed. That's definitely why. Mom squeezed his hand. And why we need reminders. Sean pointed toward the open hills ahead. So basically, we're walking across this entire landscape so God can repeat the same lesson until it finally sticks. Francis chuckled. That's not an unreasonable interpretation. The wind lifted again, sweeping across the valley. For a moment, the whole group walked silently. The road stretched forward through the wide hills, leading us steadily south. Behind us lay the quiet memory of Chet's courage. Beside us walked the steady witness of Maximilian Kolbe. And somewhere ahead, the road continued toward new lessons we had not yet learned, new people we had not yet met, the kind that can only be understood by continuing the journey.